Hey, everybody, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah.
And today we're going to be looking at something that comes up all the time
Yeah.
in our world of personal growth, and that is the ego.
Yes, indeed.
And maybe to even make it a little juicier, the ego and how it impacts our freedom.
I like it.
And to do this, we're going to be looking at
Right.
a podcast episode that draws a lot of inspiration from Osho's teachings.
Okay. Yeah. Osho's always good.
And he had a very unique and sometimes kind of a provocative perspective
Yes, he did.
on things. So I'm really curious to get into this.
Me too.
And so to kind of like kick things off,
Yeah.
the episode starts with this this example that I thought was really funny of how we introduce ourselves.
Right.
Right. And it's kind of like, hi, I'm John and I'm a software engineer.
Exactly. Yeah.
We've all done it.
We all do it.
But it's interesting because
It's like ingrained.
it really highlights
Yeah.
how much we cling to these labels,
Right.
these roles that we play.
Exactly.
And I think that that's really where the ego kind of like
That's the ego.
begins, right?
It's this constructed identity that we build for ourselves.
Yeah.
And it keeps us separate from everything else.
Okay, so it's like this invisible wall
Yeah.
that we've created.
That is a wall. And we're constantly craving validation.
Yes. Have you ever felt that need to prove yourself?
All the time.
Like you've got to stand out from the crowd.
That's the ego talking right there.
I know I have.
Yeah.
Especially like,
It's so easy to get caught up.
no, social media can be a real ego booster.
Huge ego booster. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And then you look at other people's,
Right.
wonderful, seemingly perfect lives.
Yeah, and then you're like, oh man,
And then you compare yourself.
I'm not.
And the ego just thrives on that.
I'm not enough.
Yeah, you need to be better, smarter, more successful
Yeah.
than everyone else to be worthy.
Right.
And that's where this metaphor of the ego as a prison comes in. Okay, a prison.
A prison.
That sounds a little intense.
It is intense because we're trapped
Yeah.
by our own need to be special.
Oh, so it's like this paradox
It is a paradox.
where the more we try to
The more you try to inflate yourself,
inflate ourselves, the more isolated
the more isolated we become.
you
Yeah.
become. It's
Yeah.
like a balloon floating away,
Okay, so if we are kind of like stuck in this ego prison,
Yeah.
how do we break free?
How do we break free?
Because they talk about this idea of like killing the ego,
Right.
but that sounds a bit drastic to me.
Yeah, it does.
Like, I don't know about that.
But it's not really about obliterating the ego.
Okay.
It's more about deconstructing it,
Okay.
becoming aware of it.
Okay.
So it's not about, like you said, battling it head on.
Yeah.
It's more about observing it from a distance.
Right.
Just noticing it.
So this kind of like, they use this analogy in the podcast.
Right.
Of like, the ego is like a shadow, right? The more you chase after it,
The more elusive it becomes.
it just
It
keeps
gives away.
running away.
Exactly.
But if you like stop and you turn and you face it,
Yeah,
it shrinks in the light of your awareness.
it does. It shrinks.
Man, that is deep.
It is deep.
I like that.
Because we feed the ego by
Yeah.
believing that its stories and labels define us.
Totally.
But when we step back
Yeah.
and we observe it
Without judgment.
without judgment,
Yeah.
we realize it's just a bunch of thoughts.
Right.
It's not who we really are.
So if the ego isn't the real us, then what is?
Well, that's a great question.
Yeah.
That's where this concept of pure awareness comes in,
Okay.
and it describes it as this silent observer,
Okay.
the consciousness that experiences our thoughts
Yeah.
and our emotions
Yeah.
without getting tangled up in them.
Okay.
It's like our true nature,
Yeah.
unburdened by those limitations of the ego.
Whoa, can you imagine experiencing life without that constant ego chatter?
I can imagine it would be pretty amazing.
What would that even feel like?
It would be peaceful.
Yeah.
It would be joyful.
But maybe also a little bit of an existential crisis at first.
Maybe at first, yeah, a little bit of a shift.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't be this empty void.
Right.
It's quite the opposite.
Okay.
It unlocks a deeper freedom.
Really? So I always thought that like
And authenticity.
letting go of the ego, you'd be less motivated.
I think that's a common misunderstanding.
Like you wouldn't care about achieving anything.
Yeah, I think we need that ego to push us.
Right.
But actually, a life without ego
Yeah.
is more fearless.
Really.
Because we're not trying to defend this fragile sense of self.
Right.
We can just be. So it's about acting from genuine inspiration,
So it's less about like, I have to win,
not needing to prove anything.
and more about this is what lights me up.
Exactly.
Right.
It gives the example of an artist creating freely without worrying what others think.
That's cool.
And that kind of liberation
Yeah.
must be incredibly empowering.
So it's like, screw the critics, I'm doing this for me.
That's the attitude?
I love that.
Yeah.
But are we just supposed to, like, drop our egos like a bad habit?
That's a good question.
Is that how this works?
Because it is a journey.
Yeah.
It's not an overnight transformation.
Oh, wait.
It's about gradually shifting your perspective.
So it's more about recognizing when the ego is, like,
When it's running the show.
running the show.
Yeah.
And then choosing to act from, like,
Choosing to act from a more authentic place.
a more authentic place.
Yeah. That's the key.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But how do we even begin to tell the difference?
That is a very good question, and that is what we will explore in part 2.
Oh, man, cliffhanger. Got to keep them coming back for more.
All right. Well, we'll see you in part 2.
See you then. So how do we know, like, is this my ego talking or is this really me?
Right.
You know, how do we tease that apart?
It's tough.
Yeah.
It is tough. And the source material says that, the ego needs to be special.
Right. It's always comparing.
It's always comparing.
Competing.
Competing.
We're trying to prove its worth.
Proving its worth, yes. And the funny thing is that in its desperate attempt to be validated,
Right.
the ego actually creates more separation and suffering.
Okay.
Like,
So the more we try to, like, pump ourselves up
yeah, the more disconnected we become.
from, like, the world around us.
From the world, from other people.
From each other.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
And so it's like, we're building these walls to protect this fragile ego.
Right.
But then we end up trapping ourselves inside.
We're trapped in our own little fortress.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The ego's need for control
Okay.
ends up limiting our experiences.
Right, because it keeps us from, like, really connecting.
Yes. It keeps us from
I've
connecting.
grown other people from being
vulnerable.
from just, like, enjoying the present moment.
To enjoying. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'm starting to see how this all ties together.
Good.
But how do we start dismantling those walls?
Right. How do we get out?
Yeah, they talk about, like, seeing through the ego.
Yes.
Like, what does that actually look like in real life?
So it all starts with self-awareness.
Okay.
Paying attention to your thoughts,
Huh?
your emotions, and your reactions.
Okay.
Without judging them.
Oh, so we're not beating ourselves up for having these egoic thoughts?
Just notice them.
Okay.
Just notice how often it pops up.
Right.
Trying to control everything.
So it's like becoming a detective of our own mind.
Yes, exactly. And when we can do that, when we can step back and observe the ego's tricks, we create space for a different way of being.
Okay.
We realize, hey, I'm not my thoughts. I'm not my emotions. I'm not these stories that I'm telling myself.
Right.
There's something deeper here beyond all this mental noise.
Yeah, they talk about, they compare it to, like, this silent witness.
A silent witness just observing, not caught up in the drama.
Yeah, like watching a movie but not getting emotionally invested
Exactly.
in the plot.
Yes.
Okay, got it.
And from that space, we can make different choices. Choices that are aligned with our values, with our intuition.
Not just the ego.
Not the ego.
Okay.
Not the ego's need to be in control.
So it's not about erasing the ego completely.
No.
It's more about changing our relationship to it.
It's about changing our relationship, exactly. And the ego still has a role to play.
Right.
It's not all bad.
Right.
But it doesn't have to be the one calling all the shots.
Got it.
We can learn to see its patterns,
Right.
question its stories, and act from a more grounded place.
Okay, and that reminds me of something else they talked about, like letting go of the ego actually makes you more fearless.
It makes you more fearless.
Yeah.
Because when we're not so worried about protecting this fragile sense of self, we're less afraid of failure, rejection, judgment.
Right, so it's like the ego thinks it's protecting us.
It thinks it's protecting us.
It's being so controlling.
By keeping us small.
But it's actually holding us back from
holding us back.
Real freedom and happiness.
From our true potential.
Right.
It keeps us in our comfort zones, prevents us from chasing our passions. Expressing ourselves.
Okay, I get the picture, but this is all still a little abstract.
Okay, so how do we do this?
Yeah, what's a good starting point for someone who wants to start living more fearlessly?
Okay, so the source material says to start with awareness.
Okay.
To start paying attention.
To the ego.
To that voice,
Yeah.
Notice how it shows up in your thoughts, your emotions, your interactions.
Okay.
Don't judge it. Just observe it.
Right.
Like we were saying.
Like watching that movie.
Like watching the movie.
Without getting invested.
Without getting invested. And the more we become aware of these patterns, the easier it becomes to detach from them.
Yeah.
And we start making different choices,
Right.
responding differently.
So by making different choices, we're creating a new reality
We're creating a new reality.
where the ego doesn't have as much power.
That's it.
Okay.
That's the beauty of it.
So we're not like denying the ego,
No.
but we're transcending it.
We're transcending it.
We're moving beyond it.
We're moving beyond its limitations.
To like a more authentic way of being.
To a more authentic way of being, yes.
Okay.
But to really understand what that feels like,
Yeah.
we need to move on to part 3.
So we've been talking all about this ego and how it can really hold us back.
Yeah, it's like this sneaky little saboteur in our minds, always whispering doubts and fears.
Right, like it's trying to protect us, but it ends up keeping us stuck in our comfort zones.
Exactly. And we've talked about awareness as the key to kind of seeing through those illusions.
Yeah, like becoming the detective of our own minds, noticing those egoic patterns.
Right. And the source material emphasizes that letting go of the ego, it's not about erasing it completely.
Oh, okay. So it's not like we're trying to become these emotionless robots or anything.
Not at all. It's more about shifting our relationship to the ego, recognizing that it's just a part of us, not the whole story.
Right. So it's not about denying the ego, but like transcending it somehow.
Exactly. Moving beyond its limitations to embrace a more authentic way of being.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do we actually do that? How do we live with less ego in a world that seems to encourage it everywhere we turn?
That's the challenge, right? The source material suggests starting with small steps, bringing more awareness into our daily lives.
Okay, so like what kind of things can we do?
Well, one thing they talk about is cultivating more presence in our interactions with others.
Oh yeah, like really listening to what people are saying without interrupting or judging.
Exactly, and not just waiting for your turn to speak, but actually trying to understand their perspective.
That's huge.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that a lot of us struggle with.
It is. It's so easy to get caught up in our own thoughts and opinions.
Yeah, or to be thinking about what we're going to say next instead of really listening.
Right. But when we can quiet that ego chatter and be present with another person, that's when true connection happens.
Okay, so more presence in our relationships. But what about other areas of our lives, like work or creative pursuits?
Well, the source material talks about how a diminished ego can lead to more fearless living.
Oh, that sounds amazing. But how does that work?
When we're not so worried about what other people think or about failing, we're free to take risks, pursue our passions, and explore the unknown.
It's like giving ourselves permission to just go for it.
Exactly. The source material uses the example of an artist creating freely without worrying about judgment.
I love that image. It's like saying, screw the critics, I'm doing this for me.
And that kind of liberation, that's where the magic happens.
So it's about finding that inner confidence that comes from knowing that our worth isn't tied to external validation.
Right. It's about recognizing that we're already enough, just as we are.
That's powerful stuff.
Yeah.
And I think it's something that we all need to hear sometimes.
Me too. It's a message that's worth repeating over and over again.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all of this?
The most important thing to remember is that you are not your ego. You are so much more than the thoughts, feelings, and stories that your mind creates.
Yeah, it's like we've been saying all along, awareness is the key.
Exactly. By becoming aware of those egoic patterns, we can start to loosen their grip and step into our true power.
And it's a journey. There will be ups and downs moments when we fall back into old habits.
Of course, but the more we practice, the easier it becomes to catch ourselves and choose a different path.
So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep expanding your awareness.
And remember, you are worthy, you are capable, and you are free.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of the ego and freedom.
It's been a pleasure.